Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the 31st episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. This afternoon, you will receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned in today's broadcast. Just in case anyone is new to Zoom, or hasn't joined us before, I just want to mention a couple of quick things. We enjoy having you chime in on chat. Our intention is for this to be very community oriented. So try to remember to change your setting to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you're saying. But if you have questions for our panelists, please put those in the Q&A section so that we can keep them together. You can also view other people's questions there. And if it's something you'd also like to know more about, go ahead and give it a thumbs up to upvote it and sort it higher in the queue. We have, as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, turned on the live machine captioning today. If you find that distracting, you can toggle it off by clicking on the icon, or you can also change the size if you find it helpful. In addition, you might like to put your settings in side-by-side mode so that you can see both the speaker and the slides. You can move the separator and change the relative size as well. And speaker view shows your just the person talking, and gallery view shows any of the panelists with their video on. So go ahead and play around with those settings. I can only control so much of what you see. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. Okay, if you haven't had a chance yet, go ahead and quickly click on your answer for our opening poll question, which is, what was the name of the first sailing ship on the Upper Great Lakes, meaning above Niagara Falls? And we will end the polling and share the results. And 81% of you got it correct. It is Le Griffin. And thank you for participating. It was launched in 1679. Close that. Today's episode is generously sponsored by Tom Wagner. Tom, thank you so much for your participation in the Bookworm and your enthusiasm for it, as well as your donation. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. Art might be a familiar face to many of our guests today. He's researched and lectured at the Clements for over a decade on topics such as Benedict Arnold and his 6-week journey in 2016 on the Erie Canal. He's currently working on his publication, A Story Within a Story, How Benedict Arnold Sold Out America, Betrayed George Washington, and Won the War. As a nautical archaeologist, Art Cohn has been studying the history and shipwrecks found in our inland waterways for more than 4 decades. His experiences in Lake Champlain, the Hudson River, and the Great Lakes have convinced him that any place that has maritime history will also have underwater cultural heritage. In 2018, Art initiated a survey in Seneca Lake, the largest of New York's Finger Lakes, with a direct connection to the Erie Canal system. Today, he'll tell us more about those discoveries. We also have Stacy Leroy Daniels, who is a native of Frankfort, Michigan, with 5 generations of his family having enjoyed vacationing on Crystal Lake. He is a proud alumnus of the University of Michigan, earning degrees in both chemical and environmental engineering. Having read The Tragedy of Crystal Lake as a boy in the 1940s, he began exploring questions like what caused the lowering of the lake and who exactly was Archibald Jones. This led to his book, The Comedy of Crystal Lake, published in 2015, which was really a sequel to an earlier pamphlet, The Tragedy of Crystal Lake, published in 1922 by William L. Case. All right, welcome to both of you. I'm very excited to hear and share with our audience about both of your research topics. Art, can you start us off today and tell us what prompted your current research?
Well, I thank you for the invitation to be here, and I hope to cover a lot of ground, so I apologize if I confuse some folks. I presume we can clear some of that up in the question and discussion session at the end. I'm a professional diver by training and began working in Lake Champlain, Hudson River, the St. Lawrence, all these interconnected natural waterways, which we now know and characterize as the 18th and 19th century superhighways of North America. It's where most people lived. It's where most people moved. It's how armies and navies moved. And so my focus is really to say that these interconnected waterways, the natural waterways supplemented in the 19th century, the early 19th century, by man-made canals, have created for us an extraordinary depth of maritime history. And with that maritime history, we now know there's a significant amount of submerged cultural remains that are still in storage for us and our society. And managing those, finding those, getting the public value from those things is a big focus. And I will be scattering and talking about that as we go through the presentation, focusing on canals, focusing on this survey we've begun in Seneca Lake and some of the things we're learning along the way. Next slide, please. And so the main focus of my studies is not biological, it is technical. It focuses on the shipwrecks, the watercraft, the technology of moving people, goods, and armies from place to place, in this case on these inland superhighways. And so it's been a major focus of our work to try to locate, define, create a template for the kinds of things you would expect to find based on the history of an area. And so that's really our focus as nautical archaeologists, the discovery, the study, and then the management of these public resources on behalf of the public. The interesting interconnection here is I use the term natural waterways, and in the early 19th century, in our region, we began seeing an artificial superhighway created to connect some of these natural waterways that didn't naturally connect. And that's the canal systems. And no place has done more with the canals and canal potential than New York State. And in the 18 teens, culminating in 1825, the state of New York took the responsibility to build conduits that could move boats and people throughout the state, from the Hudson River in the east to Lake Erie in the west to Lake Ontario at Oswego. And so these interconnected waterways became the internet of their generation in terms of stimulating success, economic growth, the diversity of development, migration and immigration, because now we had a water highway that could connect place A to place B. And so the New York canals, I'm happy to say, are approaching their bicentennial period, where we look back and we celebrate the genius of the engineering that went into these these troughs of water. They're troughs of water that lifted a boat or dropped a boat all along the route to accommodate for the change in land elevation. And it really is one of the great stories of innovation in our times and in our region. The canal was completed. That is, the series of canals were completed in 1825. In 1825, there was a major societal celebration based in New York, all along the canal, culminating in New York City. This is a page from the commemorative publication that was put out in 1825, which has an extraordinary collection of images from the time. Pre-photography, obviously, so it's artwork and engravings and sketches that provide us with glimpses of what it might have looked like, and of course, all the journals and letters and other archival material that paint the picture. What I would point out here is we're at the junction, the start of the Western Canal, known as the Erie, and the Northern Canal, the Champlain, heading up to Lake Champlain. And we're viewing one of the great watercraft types. It's a packet boat. Think Greyhound bus. These were long-hauling, people-moving machines that revolutionized travel and immigration and emigration. The West, your part of the world in Michigan, was settled in part because of the completion of the Erie Canal and the development of boats like this that could move people to the West in a practical manner. And it's fun to remember that this early canal, this Clinton's Ditch Canal, was a canal that was powered by draft animals. So any boat that was going to move through this canal system from 1825 till 1915 was going to be towed by horses or mules, walking on a towpath with a long line going back to the boat, hauling boats that could have 100, 150, 200 tons of freight within them. It's really quite an extraordinary part of the engineering, and it worked out really well. The people who own these boats creates the sociology studies, the actual technical use of horses, the type of tack that was used, the fact that many of these horses lived aboard the boats in a stable is one of the great things we're beginning to uncover as we find and study these tangible legacies of this period. The canal, the original canal that opened in 1825, was so successful that they immediately began an expansion plan to build it bigger. If you build it bigger, the boats can be bigger. If the boats can be bigger, they can haul more stuff, more success. And so in the 19th century, they enlarged the canal completely from end to end, replaced every lock, every aqueduct. By the 20th century, the early 20th century, the canal was kind of losing in the struggle to compete with the railroads. So they built it bigger, yet the barge canal, the canal you see today in New York State, which is remarkably still operational, over 525 miles of operating locks, canals, and conduits. They were designed for yet bigger boats. If we build it bigger, they will come. And that's what you're seeing here is the grand opening in 1915 of the flight at Waterford, New York, signaling yet another new era for the canal system. And of course, with lots of boats and lots of maritime activity, some of it on the canal, some of it on the lakes and rivers, that were connected to the canals. You would expect that there were losses, and those losses, which were tragic in their day, have become the grist for our studies now in terms of society. And we're dealing in inland waters, freshwater areas like the Great Lakes, like Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. We're dealing with actually intact three-dimensional watercraft that look in many cases just like they did the day they went to the bottom. This is just a good example of one. This is a boat called the General Butler, built in 1862, sank 10 years later in Lake Champlain. And it gives you a true sense of what we are dealing with here. Boats that are intact and give us an access to the way they operated, the economics of the system, the families that lived in the cabins. All of this is revealed by these tangible archaeological remains. So part of what I've been saying is that these resources, unlike the gold that you have perhaps seen on the History Channel being mined by treasure hunters, to us, the gold and the value here is in the cultural stories, in the lessons, in the information that these boats get to share with us. And so our organizations have advocated strongly for the public nature of these resources, the need to manage them and preserve them for future generations. And we feel an obligation to share them with people who don't necessarily dive. And so we have underwater preserves and parks in many areas, including out in Thunder Bay, in Lake Michigan. And I would also, but we've stumbled on an idea of building full-size working reproductions of real boats. So the General Butler you saw earlier, we decided we would create that full-size, operational, and our goal was to build their boat, not a better boat. And so you see this General Butler clone being built in a shipyard we established in Burlington, Vermont. And next you'll see the General Butler, now christened the Lois McClure, on her launching day in 2004, 10,000 people attending the launch and being drawn into the story and the history and the use of what were really tractor trailers. These were not fancy boats. These were not celebrated boats. These were blue collar working boats that existed by the literally hundreds. And families typically owned them, live aboard. Sometimes they lived aboard literally year round. So we put this boat on the water, and then we began a 15-year outreach program. And so we restored the look of this boat. This is exactly what this boat would have looked like sailing in her time in the 19th century. She was a Lake Champlain sailing canal boat. The mast came down once she reached the canal. And this is a good example of a boat reminding us of some history that we had forgotten. And so the boat was the reminder that there had been this really thoughtful piece of engineering done simultaneous with the opening of the canals. And we brought this boat to literally hundreds of ports in New York and Canada and Vermont that have common history with the canal era and the day of the working canal boat. And this activity for us culminated in 2018 when we partnered with the Corning Museum of Glass, which wanted to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Brooklyn Glass Works moving to Corning by the interconnected waterways. They began in Brooklyn, just about where we're parked in Brooklyn, looking over at Manhattan Island. And they went up the Hudson River, out the Erie Canal, and then the Erie Canal crossed Seneca Lake from north to south to get to another small canal, the Chemung Canal, so they could literally land their boats with all of their materials in Corning, New York. That's how this interconnected waterway worked. And in preparing for this extraordinary 5-month outreach program, we began to realize that Seneca Lake, and this is Geneva at the north end of Seneca Lake, was once a very active commercial part of this inland highway system. And so if that was true, there should be, where history happens, stuff gets left behind. And so we had a good account of the loss of a boat. And so we wanted to try to see if we could demonstrate that there would be a collection of intact shipwrecks in this body of water. We knew also that we were approaching the bicentennial era of the New York State Canal System. It opened officially in 1825. As we approached 2025, we were looking for ways to remind people of the extraordinary legacy that the canal system is, both in terms of archaeological remains on land. You can see aqueducts and stone locks up and down the system, but also the fact that this system still operates, and there's an invisible legacy that is able to be seen if we go out and we try to find them and study them. So this was a demonstration project. And what we did is we put together a very small attempt to survey over just a few days to try to find a single boat that we had found while we were doing the historic research. A boat by the name of the Frank Bawley, which sank in a storm, November, in 1867. And what we were able to do is, within the first 15 minutes, using this really wonderful newspaper account, it doesn't often happen like this, we were able to find the intact remains of the Frank Bawley lying in the deep water of Seneca Lake. We continued our survey because we had the extra days, and we quickly began to find other intact shipwrecks on the bottom of Seneca Lake. And when we say intact, I think these images really tell you that what we're dealing with is true three-dimensional objects that have traveled through time from historic times to our times to allow us to study the technology of their boats. For example, the top left image shows you a cabin in the bow of this shipwreck, number 16, and that is the stable for the horses that traveled on this boat. There's very few intact stables that we have been able to find and study. So this is a treasure trove of potential new information lying on the bottom of Seneca Lake. With the success of the archaeological side of the survey, if we can advance the slide, we also realized from our work on Lake Champlain that by using the same high quality sonar systems, in this case, the multi-beam sonar system, we could not only search for cultural anomalies, we could also systematically map and gather the data from the bathymetry of Seneca Lake. And so that really took this demonstration project and put it into a much larger project format. And with that, I will rest and let my colleague Stacy tell you a great story about the work he's been doing. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Art. This is so exciting. And I just love hearing about this project. Thank you so much. So I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section and we'll answer them at the end of the program. The success of the Erie Canal inspired many canals around the country, and that brings us back to the story of the comedy of Crystal Lake. So, Stacy, does your research and story happen during the same time frame as the Erie Canal?
Good morning to everybody. I do appreciate the opportunity to kind of continue the story and the well-laid review that Art gave of the start of the canal era in the United States. In the Great Lakes, especially in Michigan, we're surrounded by the Great Lakes, and had a history of lake shipping all the way from Buffalo and the terminus of the Erie Canal into the Great Lakes above Niagara Falls, and taking to Detroit and then around the tip of the Met at the Straits of Mackinac and all the way down to Chicago. But there's no shortcuts between the two. We're stuck here with schooners and steamers and things on all sides, but very little ways to get across the state of Michigan or to travel up the little rivers, which are drowned river mouths or glacial impoundments left from the glacier 10,000 years ago. So we're starting a chronology that would be probably when the Erie Canal was completed on into the late 1870s and 80s or so until the advent of the railroads. So I have a discussion to describe one particular canal that had great ambitions but never materialized. So you'll have to use your imagination a little bit as we proceed.
Yes, exactly. So this map I think shows some of the a little bit more of the possibilities that could exist. So maybe tell us a little bit more about the canals that were inspired in Michigan.
This is the 1822 Carey and Lee map that is the first separate map of Michigan produced in this country. And you can see many of the small rivers going into the interior of the state of Michigan, but it's kind of a mysterious area of swamps and wilderness, not too many interior towns, a few Indian trails along the periphery of the lakes, some development at Detroit, Chicago. Straits of Mackinac were just starting up. There's been the War of 1812 that had some influence here, but and most of the shipping was strictly on the big lakes rather than the inland lakes. So what's presenting the opportunity here, and some of these are very grandiose plans that did not realize, for instance, they considered the middle trail going from Saginaw Bay to the Grand River on the opposite side from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan as a possible canal. There was a Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal that was going to go across the bottom of the lake from Lake St. Clair over to the Kalamazoo River closer to Chicago. And then there's the Crystal Lake Canal, which I will have a little bit of detail to say in northwest lower Michigan, a little bit south of the Grand Traverse region.
Right. So lots of ideas and a few that were enacted, of course. So the your story takes place over on Lake Michigan, and I know that you did some research at the Clements and at Special Collections. So maybe tell us a little bit more about this image.
Well, this is the Sleeping Bear, the famous immense sand dunes slightly north and contiguous to Crystal Lake, a wild and tumultuous place. Ship about ready to sail into the sand dune there, and a lot of people wrote very romantically and poetically about the area, uncertain about whether they would start in one place and end up in the other place or somewhere in between in the bottom of the lake. So it was a treacherous treacherous coast with no friendly ports or anything other than drowned river mouths and no canals to lead them to the interior.
Great. And so, as you mentioned, your story takes place very near here at Crystal Lake. What are the unique features of Crystal Lake?
Here we're looking at a view of the fifth finger on the left-hand mitten. Crystal Lake is right in the center with Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore to the far background, and Betsy Lake, which is a drowned river mouth lake, in the foreground, in the city of Frankfort, where I was born. And the idea that was had was to have a canal go from Crystal Lake to Lake Michigan by way of the Betsy River that comes out of Crystal Lake and goes interior ways and then comes out there where the lighthouses are showing. The shortcut, of course, is just that little isthmus between, it sticks out into Lake Michigan where there's the famous Point Betsy Lighthouse, and the Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore is sort of contiguous from that all the way up for 20 or 30 miles to the north here. It was a reverse image of what was seen in the December 2020 issue of National Geographic, if anybody is related to that. This is what you see from the south as opposed to the geographic cover, which was from the north.
Thank you. You mentioned that Crystal Lake is there because of some geologic activity. So is it a shallow lake? Is it a deep lake?
It's quite interesting. It's what we call an embayment lake. It was an embayment of Glacial Lake Algonquin, the lake of 10 or 15,000 years ago. In fact, that isthmus was built up when the Glacial Lake lowered and closed off Crystal Lake. It's now 165 feet deep and almost 10,000 acres in area before it was lowered. So it was a very shortcut. In fact, most of the water that leaves Crystal Lake is by groundwater through the western isthmus rather than through the surface water to the Betsy River in the foreground.
Right, right. So very deep, lots of water for sure.
About a quarter trillion gallons, to be exact.
Okay, a quarter trillion, you said?
Quarter of a trillion. It would take the city of Detroit about 300 days to drink it up.
Wow. When did you first learn about this story, and who is Archibald Jones?
Well, I grew up in the city of Frankfurt until I was about 8 years old or so and read the story. And we sort of knew that Archibald Jones had some history with canals, but little detail was known too much. It turned out he was born in Petersburg, New York, near the eastern terminus of the Erie Canal in one of the pictures that Art showed earlier. And he migrated eventually west, dealing with horses and growing fruit, and ended up with an invitation to come north to Crystal Lake and a possibility of building a canal. He was a self-styled bootstrap engineer. They didn't have degrees in civil and environmental engineering in those days, so he picked up a lot working as a toiler on Clinton's Ditch, the euphemism for the Erie Canal. So he had a lot of practical knowledge, and thought that Crystal Lake would be a great place to build a canal because Crystal Lake was 38 feet higher in elevation than Lake Michigan at the time. It was left like a big bathtub up high on the hill, unusual for topography. Most lakes are like coastal with a little bit of rise of 10 or 12 feet along the coastal lines. So
Right.
he's my protagonist in my book, and I look like him with his flowing beard, but now that I've got a COVID beard to match.
Exactly. So now you can really do some Crystal Lake reenactments for sure. So it seems like he had a pretty good idea. So how did Jones and the Benzie County River Improvement Company hope to accomplish their plans?
Well, Jones was certainly a man before his time. He formed the Benzie County River Improvement Company in 1873 and sold stock. This is a replica of a stock certificate found under a tapestry in a local library. And the canal boat is much more grandiose with a stern wheeler, side wheeler steamboat than the little simple boat that he had envisioned to build as part of his project to fly the lake, take settlers up to new settling positions in Crystal Lake, and bring produce and timber down and ship it to the main ports of Detroit and Chicago. $25 a share would buy you a copy of this. Of course, when the canal went dry, which I'll describe here in a moment, everybody was bankrupt, so the stock certificate is not worth anything. And I'm the ad hoc pro tem president with no liabilities and no profits from this particular company. So I dress up like Mr. Jones and pretend I own the company.
Exactly. So, all right. So it seemed like a good economic idea and people were buying stock. So how far did they get on the project and what happened?
Well, they started up with all sorts of activities. Everybody was blowing their horns. And started off with grandiose ideas to dredge some of the shallows by Betsy Lake, some of the airplane turns, and then the shallow intermittent Crystal Lake. Unfortunately, the morning before you were going to put in the cement locks and make it permanent and turn on the spigot and allow the river to flow, the lake to flow gently into the river, the worst storm in 1873 kicked up and washed this dam out. And instead of intentionally lowering it by about 5 feet to make some river lot improvements, the lake dropped precipitously by 17 feet. And in a matter of 3 weeks, 56 billion gallons of water went down the drain. This is a recreation of the event, this Crystal Lake, and you can see its geological neighborness to Lake Michigan on the left. The outlet is down toward the center there where the dam was attempted in the red canal there. Yes, you're doing it with the arrow there. The red line is the canal that was actually attempted. And that's the route, as you can see from the glacial valley there from the glacial days, that was already picked just the right spot because that was the lowland to require minimum dredging. He also had ideas to build a canal to the north through the Platte Lakes and go up to Lake Michigan, closer to the National Lake Shore. And the shortcut, of course, would have been just sort of tunneled to the left there, but that was usurped by property for the National Lake Shore, or the Port Point Bessie Lighthouse. So that one was never attempted.
Right. So that you said it dropped the lake level by 17 feet. So that's what we see in the yellow, right? Is the difference.
It bounced back about 5 feet, but it did create 2,000 acres of beach, which is, there wasn't any beach around Crystal Lake. It was, you walk like a mountain, go with 1 foot in the water and 1 on the shore. And then by dropping it and forming these 21 miles of beach all the way around, we could have roads around the lake, 2 villages, youth camps, a yacht club on one end. There's a boat launch facility and almost 11,000 cottages, 1,100 cottages around the lake, right on the lake shore. And a beach that was worth about $500 million. So it was a positive event, a positive inundation. It was not caused by man. Man had an involvement with it. So it was involved in dam breaching, but it was done by natural forces.
Right. So not the economic outcome that he hoped at the time, but ultimately it had an economic impact.
It just took a little time. There were cottages starting to form 20 years later in the 1880s and 1890s. And now it's a resort mecca for many people that come north from Chicago and St. Louis and the whole western side of Michigan.
Right. So what happened then though? Did the lake stay at that level with the 17-foot drop?
Well, it bounced back about 5 feet or so, but it's been maintained about 600 feet above sea level, which is still 25 feet higher than Lake Michigan. If you wanted to recreate the canal, conceivably one could still have a flow down river to the big lake, but all that's left is this, after a series of makeshift dams that flushed out every couple of years or so and were taken out intentionally by the lumberjacks to flush their logs down to Lake Michigan and the mills. This concrete dam was constructed and it's been modified since then. It was built a little bit too high and they had to shave off the top, but now it's controlling the lake to a level of plus or minus 3 inches. Of course, that's not too practical when you have whitecaps that are plus or minus 2 feet in height on the lake.
Right, exactly, because it's a very large lake. So this photo is from 1912, but this is essentially the dam that still exists today to regulate it.
And those are Archibald Jones' grandchildren standing at the dam, and one is taking the picture of this particular one. So this is kind of a classic picture. I have another version that I also found from the Clements library that's in my book.
Nice. I love it. So now there have been some historical markers put up and some other commemorations.
Yes, in 2015, we commemorated a handsome two-sided bronze sign that updated the story. The one on the left is the one that was put by the son of the gentleman who wrote the tragedy of Crystal Lake back in 1922, but he alleged that Archibald Jones had an ambitious but ill-advised project because he thought he didn't have surveyors involved and he didn't know water flowed downhill, contrary to all the facts and figures that we discovered. In fact, the original project map that is a centerfold of my book was discovered in a wall of an 1870 farmhouse belonging to the treasurer of the Lindsay County River Improvement Company, which that story is described on the right-hand plaque. And then the center plaque is the story of Archibald Jones. And he's looking into the future for making sure that people keep tabs of his dam and report any outages and things like that. So he's right there on the spot. And we also have Archibald Jones Day for the last, other than last year, we celebrate his successful canal, even though it's not a canal and it is, even it's mentioned slightly, but it was certainly the most celebrated event that occurred in the 1800s in Michigan because it was the largest inundation from an inland lake due to an anthropogenic, an artificial cause of dam breaching in U.S. history. But that fact was not known because it was right out in the boonies.
Right.
It was 15 times bigger than the Johnstown flood that killed 2,000 people. And this one, while we lost 56 billion gallons of water, it was not, nobody lost their life other than a cow and a few thousand fish.
Right.
And then this spring, I had the opportunity in Midland to witness the Tittabawassee River Four Lakes flood that eclipsed the Crystal Lake flood by 50% or so. So now I'm an observer of the #1 inundation in U.S. history and a chronicle of my book of the second one. So it's been an interesting life.
It has indeed, yes, and certainly that inundation in Midland last year really it was so dramatic. I mean, you can really see what that amount of water can cause. So, well, this book of yours is quite thick. Well, lots of research. So it seems like quite a labor of love. How long did it take you to write it?
Well, I came across the predecessor of the book, the prequel by William Case in the 1940s, and thought there must be more to the story than that. And it took me 60 years or so to get back there. When I was an adjunct professor at the University of Michigan in the 90s, I went over and found the original survey map, the 1838 survey map of the region, and I've not stopped since. Found about 2,500 references and maps and reports, and I think I have a map for every sand grain that's around the lake by now.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story and for all of your research into the details of the story. So Art, speaking of research, when you were doing your fellowship at the Clements Library, didn't you find something in the collection that becomes part of this canal story?
Well, actually, that's exactly right. And, one of the ways to characterize the work that a nautical archaeologist or someone studying great floods from large lakes, we work outside and on tangible properties, but it's every bit as important to make sure that we study the archives and do our detective work inside as well as outside. And while I was at the Clements studying the 18th century and Benedict Arnold and the Revolutionary War times through the Sir Henry Clinton papers, it was obvious to me that the Clements was this extraordinary, truly extraordinary venue of material that related to so many different things that I began to just make informal inquiries of some of the curators. Of course, I had help from everybody that was out there, extraordinary encouragement and support from Kevin Graffinito and Brian Dunnigan, and was talking one day with Clayton Lewis, who's the curator of images, and mentioning that while I am focused on the American Revolution, the canal era, particularly of New York State, is also a great study, and might he have some materials that he could point me to. And he brought out, he knew of this collection, and he brought out a file of original artwork done by a man named John Henry Hopkins, and we're looking at one of his paintings. And what's great and remarkable about this artwork and these paintings that were in this file is many of them are dated, and there's a short travel journal. So we know that this trip was on the Erie Canal, and we know that this trip, him coming from the west to the east, was in late October, early November, 1825, the same year that the Erie Canal was completed. And so here comes this gentle reverend, painter, thinker, coming from the west, the very quiet west, heading toward New York City, where they are in November, setting off one of the biggest celebrations that the United States has ever had, because everybody realized that the wedding of these waters was going to change the world they lived in. And so this is part of the commemorative booklet that was created in 1825. Of course, the Clements has a copy of this. This is one of their images. But to me, even more remarkable was the glimpses of this just finished canal, simultaneous to this fireworks going off at City Hall in New York City. John Henry Hopkins was traveling in a packet boat, painting exactly what he saw. So if we can look at the next slide. Oh, that's just me. So in 1916, excuse me, in 2016, I was going out the Erie Canal to do research on stone locks and aqueducts that still remain on the landscape. It's kind of an archaeologist's, a historian's dream to travel. Anybody can go out and see incredible historic remains, still extant, almost as complete as when they were built. And it was 2016, just a few years before the start of the bicentennial celebration in New York, and I wanted to help make people aware of that and promote that. So I approached the Clements Library and wondered if I might get permission to reproduce 5 of what I picked as John Henry Hopkins' best interpretive paintings. And then I would gift them to historical societies, libraries, town offices along the way to raise the awareness of the coming bicentennial and share this wonderful artwork, often in the communities where the artwork was made, and people had never seen this before. So this fabulous image is looking west on the Erie Canal. You see the primitive Clinton's Ditch Lock. There's a packet boat that Reverend Hopkins is traveling on just on the other side. But to the right, what you have is that's a stone aqueduct that went off into the town. And using this image, we were actually able to find the archaeological remains of that stone aqueduct still in the Mohawk River. So these are extraordinary, insightful, and information gaining images that Reverend Hopkins left for us. And so here we're traveling out the canal. I'm traveling with my good friend, Dr. Jean Belisle from Concordia University, one of the foremost architectural historians in North America. And we're meeting with town officials and historical society folks and giving them a set of prints. These prints were gifted so that they could hang in places where the public went. So libraries, city halls, historical societies, all along the Erie Canal. John Henry Hopkins and the Clements Library made an impact in reminding people of the extraordinary nature of this canal, how much it changed New York State, but also changed the world in the technology that it brought. And so if we can go to the next slide, this is perhaps my favorite. This is, if you read Reverend Hopkins' identifier on the top, this is Montezuma, the canal, and elevated towpath at the Cayuga Marshes. Well, I had, as a historian, read about the Cayuga Marshes and the Montezuma swamps because it was one of the most difficult places to engineer the canal through because of the quicksands and the soft bottoms. And they would dig the canal prism one day and the next day it would be inundated and sunk. And it was very, very difficult. And the solution to getting boats through this area was to build the elevated towpath, an illustration of which I never saw. There were no plans that had been found about this until John Henry Hopkins painted it, and it made its way to the Clements Library. So he painted this as he traveled. And when I was in Montezuma, meeting with the Historical Society, they asked me if I would like to see the exact spot where the elevated towpath came to shore, because they thought they knew where that was. And they brought me down to the side of what is the Seneca River. And they said, this is the spot. And I'm looking in the water, and what you're seeing there are 14-inch by 14-inch hand-wrought timbers. And I said, well, what does anybody know what these are here for? And nobody really knew. They thought it was part of the modern barge canal. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that what we're looking at is the archaeological remains of the structure that held up the elevated towpath as painted by John Henry Hopkins in November 1825. So where that has been hugely exciting to me, and this is kind of just a true labor of love, the one real missing link to the canal story, in my opinion, and one that really was very exciting for me to think about is, you know, these packet boats, which operated for about 30 years till the railroad pretty much put them out of business overnight. We had no archaeological example of a packet boat known to exist. And so I'd been hoping that in part of our work, this is over decades, that we would run into or hear about or find an archaeological example of a packet boat. Now we're into the bicentennial era. In Buffalo, the Maritime Center in Buffalo is building a full-size working reproduction of a packet boat based on artwork. And so here now we're back at Seneca Lake. We've enlarged the survey to be a systematic examination of the entire bottom of Seneca Lake. And I can tell you, in 2 years of survey, we obviously did not survey in 2020 because of the pandemic, but in surveying 2018 and 2019, we have found 16 intact early first generation not packet boats, but canal boats. And this target, number 7, we could not actually examine because it was in too deep of water, because Seneca Lake is over 650 feet deep. So we needed to bring up a more robust ROV that would allow us to see it. We sent the camera down, and some of the images that began to appear for us began to communicate a boat that was not necessarily used for freight, which most of them were, but a boat that might have been used to haul people and passengers, an extra large kitchen with all the supplemental material. And then as we studied the ROV footage and reproduced it as a preliminary sketch on paper, we realized that we might have in fact found the first known example of a early Erie Canal packet boat. We will, I'm delighted to say, be going back to Seneca Lake this summer to continue the study. And one of the things we will do is go back to this and several other sites to try to confirm that that is indeed what we found. So thank you so much for listening. I think the report that we produced is going to be a PDF available through the Clements, and delighted to answer any questions people might have. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both. These are such interesting stories. And I also love how both of you illustrated how we can use graphics materials, those primary source materials that people created when they were seeing, for example, Hopkins painting as he went along the Erie Canal. So I just, that's really exciting. I am excited. I see we have a lot of questions, so we're going to answer those in just a moment. Continue to put them in the Q&A section, please. And I will just do a couple of housekeeping reminders, and then we'll answer questions. Our next bookworm will be celebrating Juneteenth on June 18th, so a day early, but we'll be having an author conversation with Crystal Lynn Webster about her new book, Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, African-American Children in the Antebellum North. So everyone who is registered today will receive a reminder for that bookworm. And just like today, if once you're registered, you will also receive an email from us after the program with the recording and resources available. You can also check out previous recordings on our website. In addition, we have a couple of interesting programs coming up that are rather unique offerings. Next Thursday at 4 p.m., we will be hosting a volunteer workshop about our online transcription project. And then on Saturday, June 5th at 11 a.m., Clayton Lewis, who is curator of graphics material at the Clements, as well as the American Historical Print Collectors Society Vice President, will host a preview of the upcoming AHPCS conference. So you can register for those if you're interested. Thank you so much to all of you for your participation in the bookworm. You're really an important part of the Clements Library, continuing these conversations, as well as providing funding as you are able. Thank you once again to Tom for providing today's funding. If you are interested in donating to the Clements, you can do so online, or you can contact myself or Anne to sponsor a future episode of the bookworm or make some other gift that's meaningful to you. All right, I'm excited to get to these questions. So let me stop my share and take a look at what we have here. All right. So Tom is asking, once there was a proposal to build a canal across southern Michigan, what happened?
I would answer that. I think you may have reference to the Clinton Kalamazoo. It started in the Clinton River. Daniel Webster actually subscribed to stock, and it only went about 40 miles inland before they ran out of money and enthusiasm. And you can still visit stretches of it. There's no canal boats behind the dry bottoms or anything like that. And there are other canals of short duration around, but as far as the Crystal Lake Canal, you'd have to use a kayak to go down the outlet whenever the dam was spilling water to make the transition to Betsy Lake at Frankfort.
So, Stacy, did they use the short section that they managed to complete?
Well, there was one boat that when the water was flowing steadily for about 3 weeks when they first had the canal breached, the dam breached. It made it successfully to Crystal Lake, circumnavigated with all horns blowing, dropping people off and picking other dignitaries up, such as they were, because they didn't have much notice. They just heard about it the morning before, and they hopped on the boat and went to the next dock, and then the boat went back downstream again, never to return. The other boat that was to be the paddle boat to actually navigate the canal, if it had become realized, was built on the shores of the Bessie River near Beulah and Benzonia, but it only went down the creek once backwards, all paddles blowing through the sandbars ignominiously, never to return. So it did have ships on it, but not immense packet boats or anything like that. There's immense saw logs still found that the divers took down through the shores. If you look down in the bottoms of Crystal Lake, you'll see 3-foot saw logs and cedar logs and things like that. But we don't have anything fancy like a stone aqueduct or anything like that.
Right, exactly. So speaking of more economically viable canals, is the canal still part of the economy to New York and New York City?
Yeah, the one of the really remarkable observations I've made in traveling the canal and trying to interpret the canal, particularly on the canal, is that most people are not aware that the New York State canal system, the Erie Canal, the Champlain Canal, the Oswego Canal, the Cumberland, the Cayuga and Seneca canals, all of these canals, 525 miles of navigable, supported waterways with dozens and dozens of locks, still exists. You can, and actually, I think it opened this week for this year's navigation season. So you can take a pleasure boat, you can take a kayak, you can rent a motorized diesel-powered small replica canal boat, and you can travel one of the most extraordinary natural, cultural, wildlife-rich corridors that exist in the United States. I think it's one of the great opportunities and great secrets that really, for folks who think they might enjoy that kind of an outing, it's really remarkable that that system not only still exists, but is still operational. There's almost always a constant dialogue going about how best to use it. There are now bike paths where the draft animals, the horses and mules used to walk. It is now bike paths and walking paths all along the canal for hundreds of miles. It's really extraordinary. So I think it's well worthy of checking out.
I would add to that I went to the World Canal Conference in Hagerstown at the end of the summer to give a paper, but they have something like 187 miles of canal in various stages. And so if you want to take a choice between New York and Hagerstown, and there's some in the Ohio area, in fact, there's still a lively publications. The American Canal Society publishes a bulletin on a quarterly basis that tells the story of a lot of these canals and a lot of the opportunities that are coming up. You'll have to wait for the 150th anniversary of our canal. That's 2 or 3 years out, but it'll be kind of a regional activity, and you won't be able to hop on a canal boat, but you can imagine.
Right. Art, to extend that question, Elizabeth is wondering from where to where.
You can travel from the Hudson River. Still, remember that as it was an 1825 image I showed, the entrance to the Erie Canal and the entrance to the Champlain Canal comes together at a junction point. That junction point still exists. And so, for example, when I go out to Seneca Lake this summer taking that extraordinary research vessel that you saw in the last slide, which is the Middlebury College research vessel. They're one of the research partners. We will come from Lake Champlain. We will lock through the Champlain Canal, 11 locks, 63 miles. When we get to that junction point, we will literally put on our, well, we won't put on the blinker, but we'll hang a right, and we will be heading and pointed due west. And then we will go due west all the way to the Montezuma swamps and into the Cayuga and Seneca Canal to arrive at Seneca Lake. And so it's all still interconnected, but you could continue that route and you will end up, so you can stop at the Finger Lakes, which are connected. You could just a little shy of that, hang a right and go north to Oswego through the Oswego Canal and Lake Ontario, or you can go all the way to Buffalo and now you're on Lake Erie. And so the canal is still a connector to all of those fabulous places and well worth the exploring.
That's amazing. I walked along it a little bit when I lived in Poughkeepsie, New York. We, traveled throughout
Yes.
the region. It was a lot of fun. So extending some of that information about Seneca Lake, Marjorie's wondering if you did anything in coordination with Hobart and William Smith colleges.
Yes, actually, we're in great discussion with the professors and researchers at Hobart and William Smith. When we were out in 2019, it was the first year we used the RV David Folger, the big research vessel you saw. That vessel is equipped with multi-beam sonar. It's a boat designed for survey. It's about the best platform we could have had if we built it from scratch just to work on Seneca Lake. And while we were out there, we invited a whole slew of folks, but the Hobart William Smith professors were all out at different times. Some brought students as we worked to figure out some potential joint research projects. For example, the good news is there are lots of intact shipwrecks in Seneca Lake. The bad news is every one of them is encrusted with quagga mussels. So we've done a certain amount of research to investigate what are those quagga mussels or zebra mussels doing to the stability of the shipwrecks themselves. And so we're in discussions now with Hobart William Smith to see if we can't design a study to help sort that out. It will help us in a management approach to understand the threats that these boats are under, maybe ways we can remediate some of that. We're also working with the New York Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, the New York State Canal Corporation, and in discussions with the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, all of whom are using some of the data set. I mean, the more ways we can share the data set and have this data set used to do both cultural analysis and environmental analysis, to me, the higher value of the survey. So we're also working directly now with the Finger Lakes Boating Museum in Hammondsport on Keuka Lake, which is a lake we intend to study. And a lot of the interpretation and program development will happen through the Finger Lakes Boating Museum. So partnerships are the secret to, I think, maximizing the value of these types of studies. And so we are very excited to work with our partners out in the field.
I would add to that if you're interested in those of you in Michigan that would like to travel north through US 10 in the Midland area, and you'd like to see the aftermath of an inundation where two lakes were completely emptied, and you can see the empty lakes. That's education in itself. Ordinarily, you drive by and you see lakes on either side and people boating on the surfaces. Now you can see the bottom of the lake and all the detritus from the aftermath of an inundation. They hope to rebuild those dams and refill the lakes here in the next 3 or 4 years or so. It's an ambitious project. It's going to be $300 or $400 million, and a lot of patience and human interest stories there.
Right. Definitely. So with all of those partnerships that you mentioned, Art, Marjorie's wondering, are there good sources for the New York Barge Canal maps for that system now, and maybe even showing locations for camping options?
Oh, absolutely. The New York State Canal Corporation, it's not the New York State, the New York State Canal Corporation, New York State Parks. There are a number of canal era parks. The Schoharie Crossing is probably my favorite, where you can see different generations of the canal still intact, including an aqueduct that crossed Schoharie Creek. So I thoroughly recommend you can investigate through New York State Canal Corporation. The Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor takes a lead role in interpreting and providing this kind of public access interface. There are maps for biking. There are maps for all the recreational uses. And it's last year they came out with a set of maps that's probably the best guide that I've ever seen. So I would absolutely encourage you to look ahead on the internet, and you will be shocked and amazed at what great materials already exist out there.
Nice. Thank you so much. So we have a question about somebody who's working on a family genealogical project. So I'm not sure how much we'll be able to help right now, but just in case, I'll read this, and then if not, maybe we can get back to this person later with some recommendations. But I know people are always interested in how to go about some of this research. Hello, I am interested in the U.S. Revenue Service Cutter as part of a family genealogical project. An ancestor born in Elgin Bay, Ontario, served in this branch, married his wife in Norfolk, Virginia in 1909, and then later settled in Sheboygan in 1930. So let's see, just wondering how to solve some of these historical mysteries.
Well, the National Archives certainly has a tremendous access point for this type of material. If this was a federal service, the Revenue Service, so there'll be quite a lot of records that should be available through the National Archives. I might suggest you start there, and then any place that they lived, if they lived in a place and got married, or lived in a place and had children, there should also be records along the way. And then, of course, I suppose this person has already examined any family records, letters, journals, things that would really flesh out. One of the great aids that we have, probably the richest source of material, are the letters and journals of the people who traveled. So I live in Vermont, and so much of early Vermont records are in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, where back in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, as the farmland, the marginal farmland, hill farmland that they were living on played out, they now had a means. That's one of the things that the Erie Canal did. They now had a means to load their furniture, their kids, put it on a packet boat, cross New York State into the Wild West, and find richer farmland for less money. And so we see tremendous evidence of this migration. And so it's a treasure trove of information about Vermont that's actually out in the West. And this is the logical explanation why. So I think follow the trail, and you should find plenty of stuff.
Don't be discouraged if you can't find something immediately. I started with one simple article in an 1800 vintage newspaper that mentioned Archibald Jones might have worked on the Erie Canal as a young man, and it led me through 14 generations of his family all the way back to his fifth great grandfather in the Mayflower, and his my great granduncle living next door to him in Emporia, Kansas. So you can find a lot of details in that. And if I can do it with A. Jones, you can do it with A. Smith or any other name there. But various variations on the name or connections of places. There was a Panama, Michigan that I just noticed very recently. It had nothing to do with the Panama Canal because it was in 1831. Turns out it's Salem, Michigan, where probably maybe some of the viewers might be close to Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. And you can see various histories there. People were very fastidious in writing county histories and township histories and state histories. And those various collections are right out there in the archives.
Right. So starting with one piece, and then it'll gradually lead you to a web of others. Okay, so let's see. Speaking of webs, Deborah's wondering, she's listening from Hamilton in Ontario and wondering whether the canal system in the States linked to this major port in the 19th century.
It did, because there was an outlet on the Erie Canal that brought you to Oswego on Lake Ontario. And of course, all that then made all the ports on Lake Ontario connected via Oswego to the inland system that already exists. And as you know, while New York was building their canals and Ohio was building their canals, Canada was one of the really active places to do canal building as well. So I've enjoyed personally traveling with our replica canal boat on not just the New York canals, but we've also traveled up into Canada. We've been to Quebec City and Montreal and Ottawa, and through the Redo Canal to Kingston on Lake Ontario. So there's still this really fabulous network of operational water systems that are available for recreation and for, I think, family fun and knowledge. So yeah, so Hamilton would have been connected. To some extent, they still are. I mean, Oswego is still a working port, and a lot of the material coming to Oswego is coming from the Canadian side of the lake.
Nice, thank you. So Stacy, Tom is asking a couple of questions about the lowering of the lake level. And so he's wondering a little bit more about the beach that was created, and also who owned that valuable new land when it happened.
Reelected land that cruise like that essentially belongs to the owners of the beach that was higher up before. It's just a matter of dividing it up, of course, with a round lake and things like that. The lines don't go perpendicular to the center, so there are angular lines, and it's caused some consternation, a lot of work for surveyors to sort all that out, because it's not one single center point. In a lake, you have a sort of a line of centers, if you will, that you have to kind of connect. I got thinking there about connecting lakes, and I had to not resist the temptation to talk about the lake-to-lake connections and refer to the Welland Canal. And if Angela will allow me, I'll just read a little couplet here. From lake to lake, these wondrous waters flow, as human love from heart to heart should run, uniting them with ties as bright and true as those which bind in peace the pure heart.
That's fabulous.
Thank you. Thanks. All right. So, how about Tom's also asking, he's saying the canal boats are not generally seaworthy. So, is this what led to their losses on the Finger Lakes?
Actually, by studying these boats and occasionally building a replica of the boat and building an accurate replica, we learn an awful lot about the characteristics of these boats as watercraft. It's one of the fringe benefits that comes from that type of experimental archaeology. And what we've determined is, I mean, we had people coming to our shipyard laughing at us for building a boat that sank. You know, in other words, how could you build a boat? It had to be a bad boat. The truth is, these boats are extraordinarily well engineered for their purpose. Their goal was to carry the most weight of cargo that could be carried through a canal system which had engineered locks and sizes and draft. So it had to be flat bottom. So a flat bottom boat that sails is an accident waiting to happen. So they designed in center boards and lee boards and other ways to turn these freight haulers or passenger carriers into more seaworthy vessels. And the problem, or the way to explain, I think, the losses of the boats isn't so much that they were bad boats, although we're finding, as I've indicated, probably dozens in these lakes. That has to be looked at relative to the number of boats that operated, which was in the hundreds, and the fact that they operated in the times of the year when sudden storms and horrible conditions. We have accounts of boats traveling on Lake Champlain that in December become so inundated with ice they can't be managed. And so, you know, no recreational boater would go out theoretically in that time, but these guys were, you know, it tells us a little bit about the economics. It tells us about the stresses that these families were under to get one more load. And so there's a whole human drama that appears in these things. And the sinkings, unfortunately, sometimes present, you know, the worst of the human drama, which is the loss of people. We sometimes see the people all made it, but the horses drowned, or and just the economic loss, even if everybody survived. And occasionally we get stories of heroic rescues. Here, these people were stranded on the Burlington breakwater, being frozen to death with every wave that came over on the ice-covered stones in this 100-year storm, only to be rescued by James Wakefield, who rowed out in a 14-foot rowboat with his teenage son, Jack, and saved all their lives. So, you know, there's a wealth of information that comes from the study of a shipwreck. It's not just the ship, it's not just the economics, it's not just the stories, but it's the interconnectedness of all these pieces of information that really, I think, has given us just a new way to study society and human nature.
Nice.
There certainly is a vast literature on Great Lakes shipping from all the previous November wreckage and things like that. Of course, we're talking deep water and big boats and some pretty fantastic disasters, if you will, much more like the steamer Missouri or the ore boats, or sometimes a car ferry that came from Frankfurt and went across to Wisconsin back from about the 1910s to 1960s or so. Those are big boats full of railroad cars that otherwise they wouldn't have been able, sort of like a canal, if you will, across Lake Michigan from Wisconsin to Michigan, because the railroad wouldn't fit on the bottom of the lake.
Right. Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, we need to remember that these waterways have been very busy. Ernie's wondering what the difference is between a canal boat and a packet boat.
Well, that's a great question, and I probably confused him that way because a packet boat is a canal boat. The packet boat that we're talking about was designed specifically to work on the canal, which means it was designed and sized to fit the locks of its generation. If you have a lock that is 13 and a half feet wide and you build a 14-foot wide boat, it's not going anywhere. So these boats have to be built and licensed, authorized and rolled with a standard looking size. However, packet boats in 1820, when they appeared, were engineered not to carry freight. Their purpose was to carry people, and to carry people fast as they could through the canal. So the 3 horses in a line that John Henry Hopkins painted of the packet boat that he was traveling on is evidence and part of the record. We believe they did typically use 3 horses in a line and could travel because their hulls were designed to be shallower draft. They could travel at 4 miles an hour through the canal waterway, and then they got right of way when they got to the locks, which of course the freight boats hated, and there was lots of conflict about that. Whereas a freight boat was designed first and foremost to carry the most cargo safely that it could from point A to point B. And then it had to have an engineered, in many cases, stable in the bow for the horses or mules. Usually there were 4 owned and operated by the family. 2 were working, hauling the boat, 2 were resting. And every 6 hours they switched them. There also was a cabin in the rear, which is where all the life of the family took place. So in these rear cabins, we get snapshots of what life would have been like with wood stoves and furniture and rocking chairs and chamber pots and the kinds of things that tell us. And then, of course, there's also memoirs that survive that are just rich part of the story. And then when you have the memoir and the object, you really get a wonderful picture of what life might have been like.
Fast forward to the current times and think big canals like Suez Canal or Panama Canal and big container ships where the containers are about the size of some of the canal boats themselves.
Absolutely.
1800s. And
Right.
the one infamously stuck in the Suez Canal here a few months ago.
Yes, exactly. So Marshall was thinking about some of your exploration and wondering if you've seen any of the ships from the battles on Lake Champlain.
We have. We did a systematic survey of the entire bottom of Lake Champlain. We have found French warships from the 1750s, British warships from the 1750s and Revolutionary War era, American warships from the Revolution and the War of 1812. We've even found what is known in history as the Great Bridge, which was a bridge that connected Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence to allow the American troops to be shuffled back and forth between those two installations. And because it was a bridge made of, think of a log cabin structure, 35 feet tall, there were 22 of those that were built by the American forces on the ice in the winter of 1777. And the remains of that structure are still on the bottom of Lake Champlain. So Lake Champlain has certainly been, the laboratory that has given us just all kinds of information about the special legacy that is left to our generation and how we might best approach it, study it, define it, and share it with the public, because all of these resources that we're talking about, military or commercial, if they're eligible for the National Register, they're public resources. So it's true in the Great Lakes on the American side, and it's certainly true in Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. These collections are all public collections, which gives us the opportunity to find them, study them, and then manage them for future generations, which is what we certainly recommend.
Thank you. So John is wondering if you know where the wreck of Le Griffin is.
I don't, although I've been very intrigued by the folks who have periodically put out statements that they think they found the boat. In fact, I can't remember exactly how long ago it was, but I believe the fellow who is involved called me to just talk through what he thought he found. And as I listened to him, and I'm not in any way suggesting that he did or did not, if that boat's been found or not, I just don't know. But I do know this, that a lot of things have been found and defined as wonderful things based on wishful thinking of the people looking. And so I do remember hearing that a group of French archaeologists came over to look at the Griffin site, the presumed Griffin site. And most of what I remember reading in the aftermath of that is everybody is still pretty much not sure. So I think that's one that's still incubating and will undoubtedly, I presume the boat is there somewhere. If the boat is there, we can find it. I mean, I've often said finding the boats is probably the easiest part of the job. Not that, going out with these sophisticated systems is really easy. It's not. But relative to managing the boat after you find it, it's probably the easier part of the project.
There are stories like Confederate gold or where did Father Marquette?
Right.
It's just everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I've often, in fact, I was involved in a Great Lakes shipwreck on Lake Erie that was found by some guys who were originally looking for a War of 1812 payroll ship, because it seems like every lake or every portion of a lake has a rumor about a payroll ship with gold on it. And I mean, to me, this is much more a reflection on us and our imaginations than documented history. But in looking for that boat, they found a different boat that we got asked to look at. And to me, it was an 1830s commercial vessel, probably an early Wayland Canal going vessel. But to them, it was a War of 1812 ship. And so people will, there's lots of ways of going about identifying things once you found it, and it's also part of the job.
Right. So thank you. So John is also wondering, Stacy, if you're familiar with the ship channel in Mount Clemens, Michigan, and why and when it was built.
We have details immediately on that. I probably could research it and give them a contact. There's various little port improvements all the way around. You get a river mouth that's drowned and somebody will want to widen it. In the case of Frankfurt, there's take car ferries in and out in southern Michigan and my daughter's area. They want to go from small lake kettle lakes to another small kettle lake. Charlevoix, a lot of the northwest corners, there's little channels between the lakes and the big lake of maybe a mile or two. And sometimes they add two lakes together like they did the two Leelanau lakes and join them together by raising the lake level rather than lowering the lake level.
Right. Thank you. So one last question from Tom, and he's wondering, while the packet boats carried people west, what did they carry east?
They also carried people east. I mean, you think about John Henry Hopkins. He was a minister in a small church outside of Pittsburgh, and he had to go to the diocese, his central headquarters in New York City, to advocate for, I believe he was looking to build a bigger church. And so his means at that moment were, holy mackerel, I can take this new superhighway, the Erie Canal, and the time it'll take me to travel will be a fraction of what it would have taken me on bad roads with a stagecoach, and a much more comfortable ride to boot. And so people did go both ways, and probably packet boats. When I say they were in freight boats, they didn't carry iron ore or lumber, but they did move mail and packages. So there would have been a certain amount of material that would have been reserved. Maybe there was more space on a boat coming to the west, coming to the east from the west. And so, but it's a great question, because the flow certainly seemed to be, going from the east to the west to all these new opening up lands, but it had to go both ways.
And there were interconnections between the Erie Canal terminus in the west, went to the rivers into Ohio, into the Missouri and Mississippi River, up toward the northwest part of the country, practically like the pioneers, but they weren't canal boats, they were river boats.
Right. There was quite a waterway system by that point. So, well, this has been a delightful way to spend a Friday morning. Thank you both for sharing your research, your knowledge, your stories. This has been fantastic. So thank you, everybody, for your good questions and attention and participation, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Wonderful to share a stage with you, Stacy, and thank you all for coming.
It's my pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye now.